Hello and welcome to a Last Word on Spurs special. Talking of words, it's book review time again. It's becoming a bit of a regular feature now, Jace, isn't it? The books.
I've done so much reading, mate. I've given up on the Beano and the Dandy and Viz. I'm into Spurs books now.
And didn't Ricky do well asking somebody from Hackney from the 60s to host a book review? Books are like kryptonite to us in Hackney. Listen, welcome along. It's three old men shouting at clouds, but remember football from the 80s. You kids, honestly, you talk about Spursy, and I'll see your Spursy and raise you the 86-87 season. This isn't a new thing, kids, by the way. It has been forever thus. Joining us this evening, this afternoon, or this morning, whenever you're listening to this, the author of Fantastic Disappointment, which could literally be the Tottenham motto, couldn't it? That could replace "To Dare Is To Do," couldn't it? Name of the book, Fantastic Disappointment. Name of the author, Stephen Peace. Stephen, how are you?
Crackers, I'm fine, thank you. Absolute pleasure to be with you guys. Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, Stephen, so listen, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to support Tottenham, yet another unlucky bugger amongst the thousands of us.
Yeah.
The story behind the book, why you wrote it, and that season in particular.
Okay. Like most Spurs fans, I probably still have my dad to thank for that. My dad was kind of born on the South Coast. He moved up to London kind of late 50s, early 60s in his teens. And he started going to Tottenham. He started going to watch them during the double winning season. And he was kind of hooked from then on. So, yeah, my dad supported them. So me and my brother, we had to support them. And it kind of started from there. So, there's been many times when I've kind of lamented him over the years, thinking, well, why did you put me in front of these clowns? But there are times when they've been absolutely superb. But do you know, Crackers, the point of the book, Fantastic Disappointment, was to just try to summarize the particular season that I've kind of covered. Because it was absolutely fantastic, but it was also a ridiculous disappointment. But I'm sure we'll probably kind of get into some of the crux of it.
Absolutely, we will. By the way, because I'll always forget these things, at FD Book THFC on the social, Stephen, is that correct? Yeah, for people
Absolutely,
to be able to follow you. I'm
that's
normally supposed to do that at the end of the show, but I thought I'll get it in when I've remembered it then, haven't I? So, listen, there's plenty of input into the book from the players and, of course, David Pleat, manager at the time, but also the opposition players from that 86-87 season. A really thorough story of all what went on and the events surrounding the club. So I suppose with the opposition players, good to get people that could see the wood for the trees, wasn't it, as well, and get their perspective on it.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started this, I kind of had a bit of an idea. I wanted to cover it because this was my first season as a season ticket holder at Spurs. I've been to Spurs a few times, many before that, but this was the first year that we had a season ticket at Tottenham. So going through the year, there were so many things that I did remember, and kind of speaking off air, Jason and I were both saying there's something weird about this season that there's an element of a photographic memory about things that happened where we can sometimes forget about things that happened a few years ago. But this season, there was something completely different. So I kind of had a bit of an idea because I thought no one had ever covered this story in depth. And here's a story that a lot of people do remember, not just Spurs fans, but others as well. And how it sort of came about, I'd listened to a podcast, I think it was during COVID. It was about Italy 90. And it was like a 35-day podcast, which covered the whole of the 1990 World Cup. Every day they'd cover the games covered that day. And it was run by a guy called Mark Godfrey, who kind of runs Football Pink and stuff like that. And one of the authors he had on it was a guy called Simon Hart, who wrote World in Motion, which is a superb in-depth book about World Cup 90. And I was on Twitter one day. I contacted Mark Godfrey. I said, look, I've got an idea. do you think I could have a chat with Simon Hart just for some advice, blah, blah, blah. And he said, absolutely, put me in touch with him. And we had a chat. He's now based in Spain now. He writes technical pieces for UEFA these days. And we had a chat and told him my idea. He said, yeah, sounds good. Sounds really good. Do this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. And he said, have you thought about speaking to any ex-players? I thought, no, absolutely. Do you know, I don't know any ex-players. And I thought the chance to even get hold of any ex-players would be ridiculously tough. But he said, well, I know a few players. And that's kind of where it all started, really. So I wanted to speak to Spurs players. I also wanted to touch a balance because Everton won the league that year. Arsenal won the League Cup, which still kills me today, but we'll cover that in a bit. And obviously Coventry won the FA Cup. So I wanted to get things from their perspective as well, because these points are still quite memorable in those players' history and also the fans' history as well. So I wanted to try and give it not just purely from the Spurs perspective, try to give a balanced viewpoint. And that's why I had a bit of joy contacting other people like Keith Houchin and Derek Mountfield. Who else did I speak to? Sadly, I spoke to Perry Graves as well. But let's not talk about that. Yeah.
And I mean, looking at the book starts actually as a build up to that season over quite a period of time and sets the picture. But of course, we'd had the fantastic Keith Birkinshaw period of 2 FA Cups and a UEFA Cup. And yes, to the younger generation, there was 3 trophies in 4 years. There was a cup final appearance against Liverpool where we were so close to winning the League Cup as well, but for a few minutes away. And then Keith had passed over to Peter Shreve. And actually, Peter Shreve's first season was actually, in my lifetime, the closest we've ever got to winning the league. Right. Forget the Poch title challenges. Tottenham had gone to Anfield, where we'd never won for 73 years and actually got our first ever win. And with 13 games of that season to go after that Liverpool game, we were joint top with Everton. Everton still to come to Tottenham. And nine of our 13 remaining games were to be played at White Hart Lane. And yet we don't win the league. And then the following season, when you thought, well, that's a pretty good base for Peter Shreve to build from, we then really struggled. We ended up finishing 10th, and we failed to score in an astonishing 19 of our games that season. And so, you know, that's the scenario going into 86, 87.
It was, you know, I think that the disappointment of Shreve's second season after his first season, which, you know, the point you make there, Jace, you know, Everton came to Spurs and I think we lost, was it 2-1 or 1-0? 2-1. And I mean, I think those Spurs fans,
famous save, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why people still think he was arguably the best British goalkeeper, even maybe the best goalkeeper in the world, kind of in the mid-80s. And I think that really crushed them. And then the season after, as you said, it was ridiculously disappointing. Poor league campaign, awful in the cups. But they did finish the season well. Clive Allen and Mark Falco scored quite a lot in those last few games of the season. I think the penultimate game of the season, I think we beat Southampton 5-1 or something. I think Tony Galvin got a hat-trick, which, again, I don't think you can shout about too many hat-tricks that Galvin could get. So it finished a little bit okay, but I think the writing was on the wall for Shreves, and I think Scholar had some viewpoints about he wanted to make some changes, which were then going to be in for the 86-87 season.
It's Irving Scholar, as you said, chairman at the time, wanted that new manager, and he went after one Alex Ferguson. And I mean, I've only sort of seen this mentioned just a couple of times. It's, I mean, talk about sliding doors moments, but he failed to lure him, and he obviously brought in David Pleat. So, Stephen, how close did we come to actually getting Ferguson? And when it wasn't Ferguson, what do you think it was that attracted Scholar to Pleat to bring him in?
Yeah, do you know, I read Scholar's book. Scholar released a book, I think it was like the late 90s, that was written by Mihir Boza. And there was lots of stuff in there which When I spent a bit of time with David Pleat, he kind of lamented some of the stuff that Scholar did put in there. Some of it was true, and some of it he said was absolutely false. But one of the things that he did put in there was the fact that he did have a verbal agreement with Alex Ferguson, and it was all kind of set to go. And then Ferguson kind of pulled out at the last minute. He didn't go into too much detail, but essentially that put him back a bit. So I think at the time there was a bit of a Howard Kendall was kind of set at Everton. I think Dalglish was pretty set at Liverpool, having I think just won the double. And Arsenal had also were looking for a manager as well. And the names that were being mentioned were Venables, Pleat, and obviously George Graham. Venables was having a bit of a nightmare at Barcelona at that point. He'd had a good opening couple of seasons there, and then things started to turn for him a bit. And then it got to the point where Arsenal were apparently close to getting Terry Venables as well. So where Spurs could have potentially got Ferguson, Arsenal apparently could have got Venables, but we both ended up with George Graham at Arsenal, who came from Millwall, and we ended up with David Pleat. I think the reason we ended up with Pleat was because Luton were playing such good football then, and he was one of the brightest young attacking English managers around at the time. I mean, that team with Ricky Hill, Brian Steen, Mal Donaghy, Steve Foster, they had a great team there, and he was massively punching above his weight with the resources he had, and I think that was the thing. And then they had a meeting, kind of went really well, got the blessing from the Luton chairman, and it was kind of done and dusted just before the Mexico World Cup. So within a couple of days, George Graham had then gone to Arsenal, and David Pleat had gone to Spurs. So everything was in place for the next season.
And you're right, Luton then, if you compared it to today, not necessarily the style of football, but they were the Brighton of today, weren't they? As you said, the Ricky Hills, the Brian Steen, the Mark Steens, Foster, they had a really good side, Luton, playing fantastic. They had about 3 or 4 in the England side at one stage. I think we played an England international with 4 Luton players on the pitch. And you're right, they were massively punching above their weights in those days. Yeah. But you're right, 1986, we take on Pleat, we go to a World Cup. Glenn Hoddle's obviously out there, Chris Waddle's out there, Gary Stevens is there. Gary Mabbott sadly missed out, probably for diabetic reasons, but that probably opened the door for Gary Stevens. But David Pleat was due to go and cover for TV, but he had to argue his case, didn't he, to be allowed to attend a World Cup, because Scholar didn't want any of it at all. Yes,
I think Scholar's viewpoint was the fact that you've joined Spurs, now get in there and work with the players straight away. And he's like, well, it's summertime, they're off on a break now, so I can't really work with them. Plus, he sort of dangled the carrot that said, look, I want to use this as a bit of a scouting expedition as well. He had a contractual agreement with ITV, so he was doing lots of co-commentating with like Martin Tyler and guys like that. So he had a contractual obligation to be there, but it also allowed him to meet up with the Spurs contingent too. I spent a bit of time with Gary Stevens as well. Gary Stevens, as you guys probably both know, he now lives and works over the other side of the world, Southeast Asia. And he kind of loves it out there. But his recollection of the Mexico World Cup is obviously fantastic, because that was the peak of his international career. And he was brought into the squad as a bit of a backup for Brian Robson, because Robbo was still carrying a few injuries in the lead up to that, as he classically did during the 80s, didn't he? So Stevens was kind of brought into the team from that perspective. What's quite weird, moving forward a few months after the World Cup and into the start of the season, Gary Mabbott then was a regular in the England squad, and he tended to take up like a central midfield position, because when he first joined us, I think a lot of people forget, he played in the middle of midfield, didn't he? He scored lots of goals, and that was his key role. So I think he was a bit unlucky to miss out. Clive Allen had come back from injury, so he probably wasn't in for a shout going into the World Cup. But as he said, Waddle and Hoddle, they were a fixture and fitting of that England team, weren't they? So they were always going to be a shoo-in. But no, I think Pleat said that point where he actually allowed himself to go and meet up with the Spurs boys there, and he actually had a conversation with Glenn Hoddle to try to persuade him to stay for one more year to see how things would pan out, and it worked quite well for him. Well, because he did stay though, didn't he?
And you talk in the book just one special night. I think all of us will remember from that time, just before the World Cup, where we had Ozzy's testimonial at White Hart Lane. And when I'm asked who's the greatest player I've ever seen in a Spurs shirt, I always give this answer. And it's not Glenn Hoddle, it's Diego Maradona. What an amazing night to see Maradona in a Spurs shirt at White Hart Lane.
Do you know, I think there's a few of us who can say that Hoddle is probably the greatest, but if there's one man who can trump him, it's possibly going to be that guy. I remember it was kind of hazy evening. It was very it was quite a weird atmosphere, not a bad atmosphere, but it was just quite a weird atmosphere. But as soon as I think our dealers and Maradona came out holding hands or something like that, and stuff like that, and it was just electric from then on. But still to this day, seeing a midfield of Hoddle, Waddle, our dealers and Maradona, oh man, it doesn't get better than that. We've had some great midfields, but that was pretty good.
I'm wondering how much that's worth in today's currency if they were all in their pomp. It is absolutely mind-boggling. Just as a little aside on that, did you? I don't know if you spoke to Clive Allen and Maradona actually borrowed his boots for that night. And he took Clive Allen's real old battered pair of boots rather than the new ones. And at the end of the game, gave them back to Clive Allen. And a few years later, Clive Allen's wife actually threw them out when she was cleaning the loft out when they were going to move. But he managed to get to the bins and retrieve them. So he still got the boots that Maradona wore that night. But yeah, Mrs. Allen, she took them out to the bin. What, these old boots in the loft? I'll throw these out.
and you know
unbelievable.
The thing I'll always remember from that night is I think Maradona got to the ground at like 5 o'clock, no training session or anything like that, meets the players. But him and Hoddle on the night, you talk about football brains. The two of them never played each other. They wouldn't even have to look at each other, but they could find each other on the pitch at total will without looking, just no look over the shoulder. He'll be there. He'll be there. I know he wants it at that pace. And these two on the night, unbelievable performance.
There was an absolute connection with those two. I think when I was kind of doing some research for the book, I actually found out that Maradona had played for Napoli on the Sunday. I think it was like their third or maybe penultimate game of the season. He played for the Napoli on the Sunday. He played for Argentina, I think, against Norway on the Wednesday. And then the next day, he then comes to London to play for Ozzy in his testimonial. So 2 games because he played the full 90 minutes. Yes, just before the World Cup as well. And it was unbelievable. I spoke to Vinny Samways because he was one of the youngsters coming through at the time, and also Danny Thomas. And on their recollection of that evening is kind of electric. Again, content is in the book that defines how they view that. But still to this day, it's a surreal moment that sticks with them probably for the rest of their lives because, again, he was Diego Maradona. Absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant. Stephen, looking back to that summer, what was the footballing landscape for that upcoming season, the expected challenges for the league, the big summer transfers and expectations for Spurs? So just a little flavour of where everybody was and who was coming in and the buzz players around the league at the time.
I think Liverpool was still probably odds-on favourite to be champions. Everton had just lost the double to them the season before, so they were desperate for a revenge. Obviously, the North London boys, Spurs and Arsenal, they had to try to do something to break the monopoly that Liverpool and Everton had it in the league. Probably since did Villa win it in, was it 80, 81? So since then, it'd been the Liverpool and the Everton show. So Spurs and Arsenal had to do something. Again, bear in mind, this was during the period when Spurs English teams were banned from European competition. So the reality was that there started to be a bit of an exodus of players. Probably the biggest transfer of the summer was was league top scorer Gary Lineker then going over to Barcelona. Again, he'd had a fantastic World Cup, but he then went over to Barcelona because he was the Golden Boot. So you probably, I think Mark Hughes also had an agreement. I think he had toddled off abroad as well. There was also, I probably will go through this later, there was also a bit of a connection with Mark Hughes potentially coming back the season after. And David Pleat tells me that there was an opportunity that he could have gone to Spurs, but that's maybe for another time, guys. There's always those nearly transfers, aren't there? So yeah, it was the Merseyside. They were the kings. They were the ones that we had to try to break that cycle with. So they were probably the bigger mover and shakers that year. But another team to watch out this season as well was Norwich. Norwich they had an outstanding season this year, and I don't think anyone had expected it at all. But I think one of the catalysts for it was that we had sold Ian Crook to them in the summer. And Ian Crook, for anyone who knows their Spurs, he was an unbelievably good central midfielder, but he just couldn't get in because of our dealers, because of Hoddle, because of Mickey Hazard. And he struggled to get down anything in the middle of midfield. So he then had to leave. But he was a loss, but Norwich's gain, absolutely.
Oh, he was a fine player. He really, really was a fine player. A little bit in that Mickey Hazard always sort of struggled a bit because of Glenn being in front of him, wasn't he? Another great player, but yeah, Cook really was. He was a fine player for Spurs and went on to do some great stuff at Norwich.
I mean, at the time, Spurs' youth team, which went on to win the Reserve League that year. Sorry, guys. By the way, I've got automatic lights on. I'm just going to turn my automatic lights on. Look at that magic. So Vinny Samways was coming through. John Moncur was coming through. So we had some real classy, quality middle of the park midfielders coming through, but they just couldn't kind of break that dominance that Glenn and even Paul Allen, Ozzy Ardiles. So it was hard for the youngsters coming through, but still quality. But that's what they had there.
One of David Pleat's first concerns when he took over was looking at the highly successful partnership that we'd had with Maxi Miller and Graham Roberts, and having to solve that problem. Two wonderful stalwarts for the club, but two hard men as well.
Yeah, it was. Again, I've kind of put it into the book. Bill Nicholson comes up a few times. I caught up with Steve Perryman, and I probably know that you guys have probably maybe spent time with Steve Perryman over the years. Yeah. He is still Mr. Tottenham. He still holds a bit of a nice, healthy lament for Irving Scholar, but again, that's maybe another story for another time. But you know, from his viewpoint as well, is that Bill Nicholson was the Don, was kind of the guru, the god at Tottenham. And Pleat tells me that Nicholson was pretty cute, pretty still massively aware of the good, the bad, and the indifferent of things that are going on at Tottenham. And he kind of questioned maybe the negative side of Miller and Roberts' partnership, with the fact that they were hard, and we did give away a lot of free kicks, and maybe he encouraged Pleat to think differently. I'm being very diplomatic with my words here, guys, but I think you can guess where I was going.
And you know, that summer Mitchell Thomas was the biggest summer signing as such. He followed on with from Luton with David Pleat, and he'd go on to actually have a fantastic season. But Pleat was definitely with that eye on looking at the central defensive partnership.
Yes,
was really keen on bringing Terry Butcher in from Ipswich. But we eventually brought in Richard Goff, who would actually go on to have a massive impact on the side, and ended up the season taking on the captaincy.
Absolutely. I mean, Goff was the one. Goff was, even today, that guy is still revered. You know, he had one season at Spurs, and he's still revered today as one of the best centre-backs we've ever had. I think the partnership and the connection he had with Gary Mabbott was pretty sublime. But yet Spurs were ridiculously close to getting Butcher. And the two people that were potentially going to go to Spurs was either going to be Butcher or Goff. Butcher couldn't hang around because they were kind of dithering it, and he went up and joined Graham Souness at Rangers. But again, I've popped it in the book.
So the chairman was dithering over a transfer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's amazing
Do you know
these
what?
things that come around, isn't it? Eh?
I tell you what, I reckon Daniel Levy
Unbelievable.
Daniel Levy studied at the Irving Scholar School of Excellence. I'm sure he did.
Stop me if you've heard this one before, isn't
Yeah,
it? Blimey.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it was kind of unsurprising. And the weird thing in Scholar's book as well, he talks about a few signings that Spurs could have made, which David Pleat refutes. And it was quite weird. So when I did speak to Pleat, I said to him, "Why have you never read this book? This book's been out for 20 years. Why have you never read it?" He's like, "Well, I don't know, actually. I think it's about time that I did read it." Yeah, there was some kind of trials and tribulations in there that I think David did refute, but Irving's put it on paper, isn't he? So who's telling the truth? I don't know. I can assume, but I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Stephen, at the time, crowds in general were still really quite poor. Football just wasn't sexy as it is today, I suppose you could say, or the rock and roll that it is today. Just over 16,000 saw our game against Leicester, averaging just under 26,000 coming to see us on average, as I said. Chelsea averaging 17,500. There's 17,500. There was weeds growing through the terraces there, and they had less average attendance than West Ham, Forest, Villa, Sheffield Wednesday, Norwich. There was 7 clubs that averaged under 15,000 at football at the time. I mean, this is top flight football. There's 15,000 corporates now at most games, let alone fans as well. It was just such a different landscape, wasn't it?
I think large portions of football were massively in the mud. I think, the European ban didn't help. It massively didn't help. And I think the reality was going to games was not a nice experience for lots of people. Women and children, you very rarely saw any women, and even lots of kids didn't tend to go because of the problems kind of sometimes inside the stadium and outside of the stadium. Going to certain grounds, even going to away games, was always even worse. It was running the gauntlet time and time again. And I think we've all got stories of over the years of kind of having near misses, and sometimes when you cannot avoid getting involved and stuff like that. So it was a grim time. But I think during that period, just after the Mexico World Cup, which because England did so well there, it reinvigorated the life of English football. And then between that and 1990, it was gradually English teams and the national team were on trial. And it kind of that between 86, 87 and 1990, that's when things gradually started to change, where I think you saw the attendances gradually starting to get up, because I think commercially, Irving Scholar, despite what we can sometimes say about him, commercially, he started to look at things differently. The evolution and the first elements of the Premier League were being discussed by Irving Scholar and a batch of chairmen within Division 1 at the time. So that evolution was starting in like the mid-late 80s and then into the 90s. And then again, the Premier League came along and literally changed the ball game. But just that pre-season, just before we sort of get into the season, Spurs went down to the Nou Camp for a 14 tournament. And we played PSV, we drew with them, and then we lost on penalties, and then we beat AC Milan. In the other games, Barcelona were playing the other teams as well, and obviously Venables was managing Barca. Even at the time, they were getting 98 to 100,000 even for friendlies. Wow. Even for friendlies, that was the difference. And so I think Scholar and lots of British chairmen were thinking, wow, what do we need to do differently? So that they started to try and change things, because, as you said, the crowds were pretty pitiful. And you're right, Crackers. Chelsea back then, it's not Chelsea now. Going to Stamford Bridge it was horrific. What an awful place. It still is.
It still is for other reasons. Sticking with the with Scholar, sort of history recalls him as somebody that very nearly took the club to the brink with some of those deals. But looking now, there's almost a mad genius to it as well. As you said, the deal with Hummel that he done was broke £1 million, and then along come Club Call phone line, which was literally like the Twitter or X of the day, wasn't it? You actually had to phone up and spend your hard-earned money, and there was a lot of parents that got some big phone bills with their kids, because there was no blocking calls or anything back in the day
Can you
to get the
number?
latest news. Oh man,
I can,
I can see the banner.
500.
That's
Absolutely,
it.
yeah.
That was.
I still remember it today.
And then
they
had the big banners on the front of one when they launched it, on the front of the program, didn't they? And they had, I think they had sort of like a mascot telephone on the pitch with Gary Mabber, and it was crazy, absolutely crazy.
They had a kind of a new executive team bus that was launched that season as well. And David Pleat was telling me that number and all that stuff was emblazoned on the bus. And the FA Cup quarterfinal down at Wimbledon, which was kind of the following spring, I think they had a training camp at Bognor just before, and the bus got trashed, unsurprisingly, because it had kind of Spurs and everything written all over it. So yeah, not the wisest of moves, but it was still a commercial move, wasn't it?
And of course, in those days, no transfer windows at all, so you could just buy as you please, as you wanted, right the way up to pretty much towards, I think the last window would come down in towards the end of April, wouldn't it, just to stop the last few games. But not long into that season, we lost another real legend and stalwart, and a person that served the club brilliantly in Mark Falco. And Nico Klassen, the speedster, had arrived. He'd impressed in that World Cup, but he had an impact on the season, but probably never quite reached the levels that we were. A Stephen Bergwijn, perhaps, is a close equivalent in the the goal against City on his debut and Leicester, but not a lot else.
No, I think the club. Yeah, I mean, Falco leaving the club was, I think it was due to the evolution of how the team were then going to play. The changing tactics dictated that there was going to be one guy up front. Falco wasn't going to get a game, let's be honest. And as you said, I think Pleat had, I think his trip to Mexico, and I think Belgium had got to the World Cup semi-final, and Klassen was a key part of that. Klassen was quick. I mean, he was rapid, but he struggled to even get into the team because he struggled to get out wide because Waddle was there, and he struggled to get out front because Clive Allen was there. So it wasn't necessarily his fault. I think the fact that two other players were playing so much better, that it was a situation of circumstance rather than him disappointing. But maybe a touch of Bergwijn about him. But I mean,
very much. But with go on, Stephen.
No. I think that the reality is that during those opening months, Pleat was still trying to find his feet. He still had maybe a couple of players that he wanted to move on. I mean, you talk about Roberts and Miller. They were a couple of guys that, I mean, when the Mabbott and Goff dynamic kicked into gear, then there was little hope for them as well. Weirdly, I mean, Roberts started in central midfield that summer, that pre-season into that, and that was his position. So he held that down and he played really well. I think probably second or third game of the season, I think we beat City at home, and he scored the only goal of the game, and I think it was a 30-yard absolute cracker. But Roberts was actually playing really, really well. Falco, he'd had a few games he wasn't playing that well, but Roberts was playing really, really well. But yeah, changes were going to come with Pleat, wasn't it?
It certainly was. That season, Stephen, the reoccurring curse of the old player coming back to haunt us, wasn't there? Mickey Hazard, Kerry Dixon, Falco, of course, had just gone, Ian Crook, David Leeworthy, Neil McNabb, all scored against us that season. And again, you get the kids of today going, oh, he's not scored for ages, or he was with us.
Yeah.
You know he's going to score.
Absolutely.
That season was horrific for it, wasn't it?
That's why we're still conditioned now to feel that ex-players are always going to score against us, because it happens so much. I mean, the Mickey Hazard thing, you know, when he came back, I mean, we lost at home to Chelsea that year. And you know, I don't know why, even though Arsenal are our rivals, I've always had more of a healthier hatred to Chelsea more than Arsenal for some reason, and I don't know why. I don't know why. But anyway, they're both just as bad as each other. But I mean, Hazard was on fire that day. He scored 2 goals, and you're right, Kerry Dixon scored as well. And I think a lot of people forget that Kerry Dixon was in the Spurs youth, wasn't he? Before we kind of moved him on. So yeah, another ex-Spur coming to bite our backsides. Happened a lot.
Didn't it just? There was a lot of players just putting their hands up, not celebrating. Or can you remember, Jason, any of them actually celebrating when they scored? I know Falco didn't, and I'm pretty sure Mickey Hazard in the post-match interview got in trouble with a lot of Chelsea fans because he felt like he said it didn't feel right scoring against Tottenham, and he got quite a backlash for that. But yeah,
I can't remember, mate. I think there wasn't so much the focus on it that there is now on social media. But the flip side of that was, of course, Clive scored against Arsenal about 3 or 4 times that season. Paul Allen scored against West Ham. Hodgie got a couple at Aston Villa or against Villa and things. So we certainly had we were certainly, Chrissy Waddle, I think maybe not that year, but scored goals against Newcastle and things like that. So it wasn't all one way.
Exactly.
Because everyone forgets Clive was signed by Arsenal, wasn't he? Just never played a competitive game for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think we got the best out of him rather than anyone else, didn't we?
Yeah,
certainly did. Talking of which, an opening day win at Villa, hat-trick for Clive Allen, which was a sign of things to come for him. An astonishing, it really was, 49 goals that season. So he won the double PFA and Football Writers Player of the Season for that. In only 4 of the first 17 games, there was a goal scorer who wasn't Clive. It was an absolutely unbelievable season. And if I remember rightly, very little of it was captured on film as well, because there was, I think there was some kind of strike in broadcasting at the time as well, industrial action.
I think there was. So again, luckily, one of the people I was fortunate enough to speak to during this was John Motson. And I managed to speak to John probably about 3 months before he died. I couldn't believe I'd got hold of him. And Motson speaks about, I mean, his memory, even back then, this was kind of towards the end of 2022, start of 2023's. His memory of those games, of any televised games with Tottenham, is unbelievable. Do you know, he was like a footballing encyclopedia. But you're right, the match of the days were minimal. The live games were ridiculously minimal. And I think maybe the point that you said earlier, Jason, about maybe things being more memorable back then is because we had very few televisual memories to buy. Nowadays, it's everywhere. You watch a goal, you've seen it 500 times before your team plays again. And you see all the near misses, and you see all the challenges and everything like that time and time again. So the world was completely different, which again, that was also part of the evolution of football in the late 80s. They had to start televising it more. And I think from 87, 88, 89, it gradually started to ramp up a little bit more.
One goal that I think summed up Clive that season for me was because he never used to blast balls into the net, did he, Clive? Everything was just passed in. There was no like 30-yard rockets, but he scored a goal against Everton. I think he scored both that day. One near post header, gets across his man at the near post. And he was so quick that season in the box, not necessarily quick outside it, but his pace over 2 or 3 yards to get in front of his man was ridiculous that season. But he scored a goal. Talk about Route 1. A goal kick from Ray Clements, and he just let it as he's going towards the Paxton. It's just dropped over his shoulder, and then he's guided a half, not lashed at it, but just guided a half volley first time straight into the bottom corner. And if there's one goal that season that I can remember Clive scoring, that's it. It was just laser precision into the corner.
Do you know, Everton went on to win the league that year, and I think it was kind of just before autumn kicked in, and we beat them 2-0. We were brilliant that day, and you're right, Clive got a brace. And yet Clem did give him the assist on that one, but yet route one, don't bounce. I think when we played football as kids, we were always taught don't let the ball bounce, but they stupidly let it bounce, and he volleyed it kind of past a guy called Bobby Mims. Bobby Mims. Do you remember Bobby Mims? So, thank God Neville South wasn't there that day.
Booby Mims, yeah.
Booby Mims.
Yeah, it was. I mean, he was having a brilliant start to the season, and Spurs was just starting to get just a touch of form there, touch of inconsistency. But we were beating one of the favourites for the league. It was either Liverpool or Everton, 2-0 there. So yeah, it was a great start for us.
Just to finish up on Clive, the Allen family, I'd done a night with him a while ago now, and I think we counted up to 11 of the Allen family that have played football or been involved in football at a professional standard. It is a crazy, I don't think, it's a crazy family. I don't think there's another family in world football with that many people and that much heritage that runs through football. 11 members of the family. It's nuts, absolutely nuts. I
mean, I think around that time, I think Spurs went to QPR, and Paul Allen was Spurs, Clive Allen was Spurs, and Martin Allen was at QPR as well. Mad Dog, they called him, didn't they?
That's him, yeah.
So, I mean, and obviously Les was kind of Tottenham royalty, really, isn't he? So, do you know, Clive's got an unbelievable recollection of that year as well. And funny enough, my catch up with Clive was just like on a Zoom call. Going back to your point about Maradona's boots, he showed me Maradona's boots because they were kind of still in the box. So, one more thing as well. I've spoken to. No, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you that later. I had a really good conversation with John Sheridan, but I'll tell you that one later.
That'll keep them listening. So the visit of Luton to White Hart Lane, and then there was the coverage of Luton coming and Pleat now being our manager going up against his old side. But there was a real diplomatic incident, a brouhaha, if you like, after Pleat's programme comments. Which almost a kid, if it's akin today, I suppose it would be like a tweet that might be sort of trashing them a bit. But it caused quite a bit of a stir, didn't it? His comments that day in the programme. Yeah,
I mean, Pleat used to write all of his notes, and I think he was quite proud of the fact that he did pen all of his kind of manager notes before the games. He had left. The Luton chairman wasn't happy with him going, despite he'd done superb stuff for them and he'd taken them well above wherever they had even been before. He still wasn't happy with them going, and he wasn't shy in talking about it with the media. So it kind of created this drama, this soap opera before the game had even started. But in his notes, this is the value of a comma. I think he referred to him as a hooligan chairman. But he was meant to finish that part of the sentence with a comma and then chairman after that. But it came out as like referring to him as hooligan chairman. So, it went down like a sack of shit, really.
And then much later in the season, given all the furore from that, there were some real ugly scenes when we went to Luton away, wasn't there? I mean, as we touched on earlier, there was still some big problems at away games for away fans and that. So there was big problems late that season, wasn't there?
I think, I mean, even in the home game, I couldn't remember this, but I read a few match reports when I went down. I'd gone down to the British Library and spent hours going through loads of old match reports and stuff like that. And they were talking about Monkey Chance being directed at Mitchell Thomas during the game. And then the flip side of the game at Kenilworth Road that I think the following spring, it was all the anti-Semitic stuff because David Pleat and obviously Irving Scholar, they are of Jewish heritage, and it was kind of pretty obscene. So much so that the directors kind of staged a bit of a walkout because it was just not reflected or even apologised from the Luton board at the time. So, but you know, Crackers, as he said, football was it wasn't uncommon back then.
No.
This stuff was ridiculously common. Just like John Barnes, I think when he went to Everton, like I'm sure it was Everton. Sorry, Everton fans, throwing bananas at him on the pitch and stuff like that. These things were quite common in football. So
hence the low gates as well.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why it was a pretty toxic place to go to even try to enjoy football. And if it wasn't stamped out by the hierarchy of each clubs, which I think Irving Scholar took umbrage with at the Kenilworth Road game, you thought, what's the hope of football? So maybe comes back to the viewpoint of hooligan chairman. Maybe too far off. Yeah.
Perhaps the missing comma wasn't a missing comma after all.
No, exactly. Yeah, subtle work, Mr. Pleat. Subtle work.
And we went and repeated our success of Anfield of a couple of years before that, where Clive yet again got the winner, 1-0 win at Anfield, and we were right on the cusp of here we go. We're in a title challenge here, but then typical Spurs form, 3 or 4 home games, don't get the points, and the old traditional inconsistent, the Spursy tag is there even in those days.
Yeah, I mean the win at Anfield again. It was a 1-0 Clive Allen. Chris Waddle was on fire that day. Do you know, Chris Waddle, this was his second season, and his first season was a touch disappointing. I think he was struggling to settle in, so we'll kind of give him that one because Waddle was a class player. And I don't think anyone had seen the quality that Waddle had until that season really kicked in. But that's when he really started to play well. And so he had a touch of inconsistency, but that day at Anfield, Waddle was the man. Waddle and even Tony Galvin, I remember that they both dominated those two fullbacks that day. And it was an absolute justified 1-0 win. But yet after that, inconsistency hits. As you said earlier, Crackers, Spursy isn't just a new thing.
No,
it's also prevalent back in the day.
I went to Anfield for that game, and you're right. Chrissy Waddle and Tony Galvin that day were absolutely sensational. I think Galvin just burnt a little bit from that League Cup final where he got kicked out of it. So I think Liverpool always held a special place in his affections to be, as you say, diplomatic. And whenever he come up them again, up against them again, he always put in a real shift. And we were sensational that day. I remember the day very well.
Do you know Galvin? I mean, again, I know we'll probably talk about Galvin later, but David Pleat loved him. David Pleat was an absolute fan of Tony Galvin. And I think Galvin had a couple of injuries, which kind of kept him in and out. And then Spurs made a pretty significant signing on the left side towards the end, just as the winter started to kick in, which restricted his playing time as well. But Galvin was, well, Tony Galvin's Tony Galvin. We know and we love him for so many other things. And he had a lot of good games that season. But yeah, Anfield was one of his best ones.
One of the games that season, and we've tried to avoid talking too much about specific games, but one that will always stand out, I think anyone that saw it will remember that, was the home game with Wimbledon. And you talked about Gary Stevens earlier. I know Gary because I spent time living in Thailand and had a few dinners and such with Gary, and he was on the end of a horrific challenge that day. And it was the most, I think, you know, probably the two games that stand out in my mind was the Barcelona Cup Winners' Cup semi-final, when people think of the Barcelona now, they were absolute brutal in that semi-final, weren't they? Anyone that saw that semi-final. And this was as close to that. You know, people think about the Battle of the Bridge with Tottenham Chelsea. This was an evil game with Wimbledon. They really were shocking, weren't they?
I mean, they couldn't match Spurs for quality. They were never gonna match us in any way, shape, or form. They just beat us up. And the reality was they targeted Graham Roberts all game. And you know, in fairness to Robbo, he he bit his lip time and time again, but they were just relentless. But the challenge on Gary Stevens was, I remember reading. I found some articles after the game. Fashanu was still denying that he had anything to do with it, which was ridiculous. And finally enough, in one of the programs, a couple of games later, I found an image of it, of Fashanu kind of elbowing. That's right. And I was talking to Gary about that, and I sent it to him, and he remembers the image was there. So yeah, I don't know if I brought back good memories, but I think he appreciated seeing the image again. But again, a couple of years later, he Wimbledon did him again, at White Hart Lane, kind of in the right back area where Vinnie Jones did him. So yeah, Gary was, when I spoke to him, and he got a touch emotional about some of those bits because he was playing so well at the time as well. That it was Stevens and Thomas at fullbacks, and then Goff and Mabbott in the middle, and so it was a shame. But yeah, that was pretty much carnage that day.
The Fashanu, of course, later on, not that game, but a few years later, leaves horrendous scars on Gary Mabbott, doesn't he? Which Gary still bears today.
The thing that annoys me about that is that the guy constantly comes across as the victim. It's sort of, he takes no ownership, no accountability at all for anything he did. Which, if someone does something and they kind of own it, fair enough. It may have happened in the heat of battle, whatever. But the guy's was just like living in a delusion. He didn't accept any level of responsibility at all. Which, I think for me and any football fan, that's just not going to happen, really, is it? No, sorry, keep going.
So he hasn't done the foreword for this book then, Stephen, Mr. Fashanu. I take it, but you're right. Yeah, he took no responsibility really, or he claimed with with Mabbott a few seasons later that Gary was okay and accepted his apology. And no, they were just an awful side. They really were. But coming back to Spurs, balance of the side. Don't know. There was something just not quite right in there. I don't know whether we were just missing a certain type of player, or I don't know. There was something you couldn't quite put your finger on. And then came the big monumental decision to drop Glenn Hoddle away at Norwich, and that really did backfire on us, didn't it?
Yeah, it's I think even the papers went to Bobby Robson at the time, because again, Hodder had cemented his place in the England team, and they'd gone to Bobby Robson because it was a bit of an outrage. I think Pleat's reasons for dropping him were kind of genuine. I don't think there was any malicious intent about what he wanted to do, but he felt that Glenn wasn't playing as well as he could have done, and he felt it could have inspired him to start to improve. But yeah, it backfired massively because Spurs ended up losing the game as well. Ian Crook
ran the show,
scored again. So yeah, I think Pleat then thought, do you know what? I've left out our best player. Well, our potential best player, we've lost. Where do I go from here? And that's when things started to really change from a tactic perspective.
Yeah, and of course, the following week we went to Oxford, and that's where this season, I suppose, flips from the start to what then followed when we changed from the basic pretty much 4-4-2 to a 4-5-1 formation with Glenn playing as a classical number 10, wasn't it?
Yeah, this was the absolute change. This was the point where, I remember seeing an interview with Arsene Wenger a few years ago, because Wenger spent time with Hoddle at Monaco, and he could not believe how Tottenham and England never built everything around Glenn Hoddle. Tottenham did, but England never did. And him going into that role, which what they did with him when he moved to France was an absolute revelation. The thing is, if you speak to Hoddle, if you read his stuff, or if you look at any interviews, he still feels the first time he played that role was when he went to Monaco. But I think the reality was he started to do it then. Playing in that, it was a bit of a Platini role where you kind of, there was no defensive responsibilities. all he was doing was feeding Clive Allen and supporting the attack, because that's where he was kind of used. And that Oxford game, the 4-5-1, was where it really kicked in.
We had a fantastic live game at Old Trafford. The diving header from Mabba. Before I get the rest of the question, I have to come to that first, Stephen. That diving header in that game from Gary Mabba was an absolute belter, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, I think maybe a week before, something like that, I'm sure he'd scored for England as well. I think England beat Yugoslavia 2-0 or 3-0, and I think he scored like a towering header.
Got one, yeah.
Hoddle corner, Mabbott header. Old Trafford, Hoddle corner, Mabbott header. Do you know what? That Old Trafford game, and I know you mentioned it earlier, Jason, it was televised, so it was the first major televised game that year, and it was an absolute cracker. I mean, I know lots of players and supporters talk about the Oxford game being the pivotal thing for the 4-5-1. I actually think that was more of the pivotal game, because what actually happened was Spurs were 2-0 down at half time and we were not playing really well at all. What he did, Paul Allen was playing at right back, and Ozzy Ardiles was in the middle. What he then did, he took off Ozzy Ardiles, he brought on Danny Thomas at right back, and he put Paul Allen in the middle of midfield. And for me, I think that was the catalyst for the season. The 4-5-1 was massive, but putting Paul Allen into the middle of midfield, that guy just went on an absolute rampage for the rest of the season.
Fantastic
He was
season.
absolutely immense. And I think that switch in that second half at Old Trafford, we were 2-0 down. We then went 3-2 ahead. And I mean, Paul Allen was kind of pivotal for that move to start to change. So I think that was just as pivotal as the Oxford game, if that makes sense.
We went on to win at Chelsea just after that, but transfer speculation was now rife, and we saw Graham Roberts leave. Again, that was really under a cloud, and really with a lot of bitterness involved in that as well. We had a mid-season break, and then found out from there that it would actually be Glenn's last season with the club as well.
That's right. It was Spurs had actually gone to Bermuda for a friendly in December. I mean, how often would you fly to the Caribbean between? I think it was after I think it was a home to Watford. I think we'd beaten Watford at home, and then the next weekend we were playing Chelsea, and Spurs take their guys out to Bermuda for 3 or 4 days of golf. They did play a game. They did play a game. And yeah, that was the time. I think Hoddle had spoken to a reporter and said that, yeah, I am looking to move. And I think France was always going to be the chosen destination. I think there were a couple of German clubs in for him as well. But yeah, then when they came back from that, I think that's when things started to kind of hit home for Graham Roberts, when he realised that he wasn't going to be back at the club. And I think just before the Chelsea game, I think they kind of shipped him out and sent him up to Glasgow. So yeah, it wasn't the most glorious of departures for someone who was served the club so well, but yeah, it was a bit disappointing.
And there was that dismissive thing, wasn't there? He's kicked a few down here, so now he can kick a few up there, which rather takes away a hell of a lot of Graham Roberts' achievements. Whatever people think of Graham Roberts now, I mean, certainly crackers and that will say he was a massive part of our early 80s success, captain of a UEFA Cup side, and he was a tough cookie, wasn't he, Robbo?
I did ask Pleat about that comment. He does regret that comment, but again, it's hindsight. The fact that I think Pleat and Roberts never met, never kind of saw things eye to eye, and that was one thing. And I've heard Robbo on some podcasts and interviews and stuff like that, and he has a healthy lament for Pleat, which is kind of understandable. But yeah, cannot forget what he did for Spurs, because he was fantastic. Weirdly, in that game, that Old Trafford, which where Spurs were kind of losing, and I've heard Graham Roberts say this on the podcast. Apparently, Clem got him by the scruff of the neck and said, "Mate, pull yourself around. You know, if you're going to leave this club, because it was very likely he was going to leave, pull yourself around. You know, do yourself justice. And apparently, Robbo had an absolute storm in that second half against United at Old Trafford. So, yeah, he kind of went out with a bit of a bang.
Stephen, wouldn't it be lovely if our away form of that season could be replicated this season and the season after and the season after that? We had away wins at Anfield, at Stamford Bridge, draws in the North London derby, and both Manchesters. I mean, that was that. I think today that's
the big six.
Oh man, I'm beaten with them. That's title winning form today, isn't it?
If you think we won at Villa, if you think of it today, we won at Villa, and I think, did we draw at Newcastle that season?
Yeah.
I think we did. Yeah. That'd be pretty good form this year, wouldn't it?
I think when I did speak to Clive Allen, he hails that Chelsea away win as the best away performance of the season. I think Jace, you might want to talk about maybe one or two other games where he probably hails as the best performance of the season, but the best away performance was the one just after Bermuda. Oh, by the way, they hadn't done any training or anything like that at all. No. And they turned up to Stamford Bridge and absolutely nailed them. So
unbelievable.
Good prep.
And then that 4-5-1 then saw the arrival just before Boxing Day of Stevie Hodge from Aston Villa, and he really that really did complete that famous five in midfield, because Hodgie went on to have a fantastic season for us. And then Boxing Day, we saw the first of two visits in a short space of time of West Ham, because we played them in a cup tie, and we absolutely battered them. Talk about getting battered everywhere they go. We beat them 4-0 on a Boxing Day, and I think they came back for a cup tie a few weeks later. We put 5 past them, and Clive, Paul, Hodgie was in fantastic form. Nico Klassen was in brilliant form in one of those games as well. They were just two wonderful performances, weren't they?
I mean, I don't know if you remember this one, Jason. It was the sunny Boxing Day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And Hodge made his debut. I mean, Spurs ripped him to absolute pieces. That balance on the left side, Hodge on the left and Waddle on the right. The fact that you had our dealers, Paul Allen in the middle, and then Hoddle just in front. I mean, Clive Allen must have been like, oh my days. No wonder I'm scoring so many bloody goals. But it turned out, I mean, those two games, I mean, I think 9-0. I think there was a 5.
I think they might have got one in the replay, didn't they? Was it 5-1 the replay? So it might have been 5-0.
Wow. So I think that the reality was, when they came to White Hart Lane that season, West Ham had a torrid time. Yeah, all good to see.
One of the big stories that went against us of that season was the League Cup semi-finals. It was nuts, wasn't it? Clive Allen, 49 goals scored in those 3 games against Arsenal, and they 3-2-1 wins they got against us, and it was literally in a matter of, what was it, about 5 or 6 weeks, I think. It might have even been within a month, just over a month. 3-2-1 wins, and so some of those we absolutely chucked away, didn't we?
Yeah. This is where I want to stop all this. I wish it never happened. Can we stop now and not talk about these?
Do you know, when I speak to Clive on stage at nights, his eye actually twitches a little bit like Herbert Lom in the Pink Panther movies. You know, it still cuts deep.
This was the one where you speak to any players with what happens at the end of the season, like in the FA Cup final, which was disappointing enough. This one, I think, still hits them harder because we shouldn't have lost. We should have
played them in the league first, didn't we? I mean, why there's 3 games is because we played them in the league, I think January the 5th, something like that, at White Hart Lane, lost to them 2-1. Then we've gone to Highbury, won the first leg of the semi-final, 1-0. We go 1-0 up in the second leg with Clive, and then it goes wrong. That finishes 2-1 to Arsenal. So it goes to a replay, because no extra time or penalty, no penalty shootouts, obviously, which you get today. So it became to a replay. We go 1-0 up in the replay with Clive again, and we're 1-0 up with about 88 minutes gone, aren't we? And suddenly we lose it. And I think the last kick of the game, and over 3 games, the only time we're behind is in something like the 358th minute. I mean, ridiculous.
Right. I think it was
horrible.
When it went to the replay, they had to just toss a coin because they were like, "Where's it going to be played? Highbury or Tottenham?" And Richard Gough said to me that he tossed a coin and he won, and he said, "We'll play it here." And apparently, he went back to the dressing room, and Hoddle said to him, "Mate, what are you doing? We should have gone to Highbury. We would have probably done them at Highbury." I think Spurs were more confident at Highbury that season than they were at White Hart Lane, which is quite weird. But yeah, you're right. It was the last couple of minutes of the third game, and that was the only time when they were ahead. I spoke to Ian Allenson, who was one of the guys who scored that day.
They were horrid goals as well, weren't they?
They were awful goals.
Horrible goals.
Do you know what? Ian Allenson's a lovely guy. I hate to say it. He's a really nice guy, but that was the highlight of his career. He's never done anything at Arsenal. Nothing has eclipsed that. He didn't even play in the final. He didn't even get into. He wasn't even on the subs bench. So yeah, that was the peak of his career. And then I think David Rocastle scored the winner in 91st minute or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, that's when things started to kind of tail off a bit because we were in for the treble. We were, I think, third in the league at the time, semi-final. We'd won the first couple of games in the FA Cup as well, so we were kind of coasting. We kept keeping clean sheets, scoring goals, keeping clean sheets. Yeah, and then we faced Arsenal.
Horrible. I'm still not over it. Rick's not over Nottingham Forest in the cup last year, but I'm still remembering this one from '87, mate. I tell you. Horrible.
I'm kind of thinking, Jace, if we was doing podcasts then, and social media was about, can you just imagine what it would have been like? Oh,
you know,
Clive's 49 would have been inconsequential because he should have had about 58 from those two games because he missed chance after chance after chance in those two games.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, Richard Gough kind of says, Clive did miss probably 2 or 3 absolute Clive Allen sitters, but then on the flip side, he scored so many other fantastic goals during the season. Maybe chances that you might not have expected him to get. So. Swings and roundabouts and all that type of stuff. But he scored in every game. He scored 3 goals in the 3 games anyway.
Every game in the cup side.
Yeah. He should have scored 6.
and you're right. We continue to make progress in the FA Cup, and the highlight for me of that run was particularly in the context of how horrible that Wimbledon game had been, and they'd absolutely bashed us up. I think they beat Everton in the 5th round. That was live on the telly. That was you saw Wimbledon at their most notorious in that game as well. And you're right, Everton won the league, but they were completely unsettled by Wimbledon's roughhouse tactics at Plough Lane. Yeah. Plough Lane, for people, if they don't remember Plough Lane, used to hold about 8,000, didn't it? Yeah. I mean, as soon as you made a clearance, the ball went out the ground. It was horrendous little ground, wasn't it, Plough Lane? And we got drawn away there. I can remember my dad thinking, I hope we don't get Wimbledon away. And sure enough, Wimbledon away came the tie. But what a performance that day. Not necessarily classic football, but Glenn's performance that day. Yeah. People forget how Glenn could look after himself. He was never a dirty player, but he didn't go and hide when the tackles were coming in. And we ended up winning that game with 2 iconic goals from Hoddle and Waddle, didn't we?
Yeah. Richard Gough was very keen to make that point. He said, Hoddle never went missing. No. He said he would put his foot in. He would never kind of shirk anything. And because sadly, that was British football at the time as well. You couldn't, even though he was, sometimes people see him as a luxury player, you couldn't get away with not putting your foot in sometimes and getting involved. So he did that. Just a touch of context just before that game though, Jason. So after the disappointment of the Arsenal trilogy, Spurs played QPR at home and we won 1-0. And sadly, Danny Thomas got injured. an injury that was to kind of end his career. I mean, when I spoke to Gary Stevens on this, because Gary's still good friends with Danny. Danny now lives in Florida. Gary Stevens was kind of welling up. We had to stop when we went through this because it was such a heartbreaking scenario for them. And then it was not long after that, then they gone to Plough Lane, put in a superb performance. Gary Stevens came back at a right back to kind of replace Danny Thomas. And defensively, they were superb, and 2 late goals by Hoddle and Waddle. And Jason, do you remember what they said in the interview afterwards?
I think they dedicated the goals to Danny Thomas, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Which became obviously the line in Hot Shot Tottenham as well, didn't it? Or Danny, all the goals are going to be for you.
Yeah. So I mean, very rarely back then did you have players that their careers would be over from an injury. You didn't hear of that too often at major clubs, or players out for a whole season. For some reason, those things didn't happen too often. And I think at the time, I don't think Danny Thomas thought his career was going to end. When I spoke to John Sheridan, the old limping physio, lovely guy, absolutely fantastic guy.
He'd come with Pleat as well from Luton, hadn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. As well as Trevor Hartley, who was the assistant manager. He talks about how swift he was reacting to that. And he said, he might not have ever been able to use his leg again if he didn't do a couple of things on the pitch after that injury, because it was so severe. I mean, even in Clive Allen's book, and I spoke to Clive about this, and Crackers, I don't know, he may have mentioned this to you in the past. The guy who did it, he was pretty well known for being a bit of a savage. Did he do it on purpose? Did he not do it on purpose? Was there intent? Was there not intent? It was just reckless, and it ended someone's career. So, that kind of had that for Spurs to go and win at Plough Lane, which was an awful place to go. I think that was a bit of a catalyst. Plus, they played really well as well. But I think the catalyst was maybe Danny Thomas.
Talking of Hoddle and Waddle and the ridiculous nature of Plough Lane, we go even more ridiculous now. And all of a sudden, on top of the pops, up pops Hoddle and Waddle with their song Diamond Lights. I mean, this wasn't the time for it. It was
it's not a cup final song either, is it?
No, it's not a cup final song. Footballers are hard men still, although that's beginning to come to a little bit of an end. But this just wasn't the dumb thing for footballers. And there they are, dressed like Miami Vice, jumping around on top of the pops. It was a great song, but just crazy, real left field stuff.
I know those two were pretty tanked before that performance on top of the pops. I think it was the only way they could probably get through it. Not really Lennon and McCartney were they? But I think the reality was that was kind of also one of the commercial changes in the world of football, really, wasn't it? Players were personalities, and Hoddle and Waddle, because they were playing so well for Tottenham in England, they were a name, and someone told them. I think the story goes was, I think around, the day after Hodges' debut when we beat West Ham 4-0, the next day we had to go to Coventry. The next day, 24 hours, we had to play another league game the next day, and we lost 4-3.
One sub in those days as well, don't forget.
And one substitute. And I think it was after that event, Hoddle and Waddle went to like a publicity, or they'd gone to some sort of media event in the Midlands somewhere, and one of their old friends or someone like that said, you guys can sing, by the way, and that's where it came from. And over a few months they persuaded them to record this song, and that's where Diamond Lights came from, apparently.
They actually tell me on the nights I do with them that they recorded it, and then it sort of got kicked into the long grass a little bit, and it got released. It done well, and they were going to Top of the Pops and couldn't remember how to sing the song. They'd literally forgotten the lyrics, so they had to have the cab driver put the tape on so that they could practice in the back of the taxi to mime on Top of the Pops that night. But then it just absolutely ridiculous stuff.
that story is absolutely true. I stumbled across, when I was doing the research for this book, I stumbled across it was footage from the BBC for the FA Cup final. Do you remember back in the day, hours of build up, wasn't there? And I found it on YouTube, and they were talking about the season so far, and they actually had footage of Hoddle and Waddle in the taxi telling a guy to put the tape on. So they were trying to sing the words before they got to Top of the Pop studio. So that is an absolutely true story. Yeah.
And not that wasn't even the most bizarre thing of that season.
No.
We played our FA Cup semi-final, and we faced a wine bar waiter, a Somalia, in goal. I mean, literally, there was a wine bar waiter in goal for Clive Allen to go and tuck his old bib in, get his knife and fork out, and go and have a good go at, wasn't there? Wine bar waiter in goal. This is like Luxembourg, isn't it? Playing the internationals. It's crazy.
I think he was a son of one of the Watford directors. I think he played football back in the day for some Welsh non-league club, so he wasn't a complete and utter novice. But he was still a wine bar owner from I think South Wales or something like that. But I think that the story goes because Graham Taylor was managing Watford at the time, and I may be wrong. I think Tony Coton was number one at Watford then.
He was injured, wasn't he?
He was injured, and then Steve Sherwood was the backup, and apparently he was injured as well. But I'm sure I'd read something that Steve Sherwood was adamant that he could play. So,
he dislocated his finger, if I remember rightly, but then
something like that.
He tested it and said it's okay, but
right,
he still got dropped in favour of a wine waiter because he happened to be the chairman's son. FA Cup semi-final. It's just ridiculous, isn't it?
You know, if you can pour a nice chilled Chardonnay, you're in. Come on, lad, you're in.
I think we were 3-0 up in about 15 minutes. And with all the crowd singing, you should have stayed in a wine bar. I mean, it was just. Do you
know what was quite nice for that? That was up at Villa Park. I remember going up to that. I can remember going up to that feeling quite nervous, probably because of the Arsenal semi-final. But going 3-0 up after about 25 minutes, half an hour, it was like I think we've got this. I think we've got this. So that was a great game. Fantastic day.
One of the horror games in our history is that semi-final we played against Newcastle or was it Everton at Ellen Road? Where we had one side of the ground and they had three, but that one side held as many. And the players saying, you looked around, it just felt wrong, even though the numbers were the same. But that day at Villa Park, playing against Watford, they had half the Holt end, and Tottenham had the other side of the Holt end, and then all down the Aston Road, and then all down, the Trinity Road. And it felt like 7/8 of the ground was just full of Tottenham and this tiny little Watford contingent in the corner. It felt like that famous game at Highbury when Ricky Villa did Wolves. Remember when pretty much Tottenham took over the whole place?
Yeah. You know, I know football has changed. I sort of miss the semi-finals at those grounds. Yeah, if it was a Highbury, a Villa Park, and Old Trafford and stuff like that. I was lucky to spend a bit of time with Stephen Clements.
Ellen Road semi-finals.
No. I was lucky to spend a bit of time with Stephen Clements. And I know it's kind of slightly off topic because out of all the players from that team, Ray's the only one who's sadly not with us anymore. But I managed to get hold of Stephen and I've spent a bit of time with him. Lovely guy. I mean, he still remembers the FA Cup final, but again, that's probably, we can talk about that a touch later. But he talks about when he played for Spurs in that semi-final against Arsenal. Was that 2001 at Old Trafford?
At Old Trafford.
Yeah.
He talks about the level of apprehension he had just before walking out. He was like, he felt his legs had gone. And it was just pure nerves, pure apprehension. And he said, but as soon as I got out there, legs were fine. And he says, I loved it. He said, what a buzz. But I think semi-finals I think it's probably worse losing a semi-final sometimes than it is a final. But speak to ex-players on that. I'm sure they'd probably tell you otherwise. But they're always harsh, those losses, aren't they?
Yeah. And our home season finished that year with two memorable games. One being Glenn's last goal, where I think everyone's seen it on the big screen now, where he scores the ridiculous goal against Oxford and just dumps Peter Hucker on his backside. But then the following week, which was I think just a week then before the cup final, it might have even been the May bank holiday or something before the cup final, when we played Man United at home, and Mitchell Thomas, like we said, who joined earlier in the summer, scored twice, one memorable bicycle kick, and we absolutely smashed Man United 4-0.
Yeah. I mean, those sort of final two games, again, I remember them, brilliant sunshine. We know we're going to a cup final. It kind of life felt good. The Oxford game, Spurs were brilliant that day. You know, we were 2-1 up going into the last, and Spurs should have been 3-4-5. God knows, that it felt a bit like that Luton game yesterday. You know, we just didn't take all of our chances, but they were absolutely dominant. And then the last minute, Oxford coming ahead, Goff towers the header out, and it falls to Hoddle. He's in his own half, and he kind of takes it, runs through, puts Pete Hucker on his arse, and just wanders the ball in. I did try to get hold of Peter Hucker for the book. Sadly, didn't reply.
He's never got off the floor.
He never came back to me, bless him.
No.
Still trying to pay to get back in, I think, wasn't he? After that, wow.
Yes, yeah. I think nowadays, again, I know it's a slight tangent. I'm sure he's had a coaching connection with Spurs. I'm sure that there's some sort of connection of Peter Hucker and Spurs, but again, that's another thing. So, but the other one you said there, Jason, yes, we beat United 4-0, and Alex Ferguson was in his first season. Ferguson was absolutely embarrassed after that game, because Spurs had absolutely run them ragged. Must have been embarrassed if Mitchell Thomas scores two. One of them's a bicycle kick, and he could have had a hat trick. So yeah, I'd have been embarrassed too. Sorry, United fans. Brilliant.
Stephen, a young side completed our season against Everton. The club were fined for fielding a weakened side, obviously with the FA Cup final coming up. But heartbreak would follow at that FA Cup final, particularly for Gary Mabbutt. I think that'll always be remembered as the Holston shirt final, won't it? It was a strange old day. There was lots of things that just never came our way on the pitch, off the pitch. It was a strange final.
It was, earlier, when I mentioned I'd spoke to John Sheridan, no one had noticed, and it was only at the point where the players had come out wearing their tracksuit tops. John Sheridan was gathering all the tracksuit tops just as the game was about to start, and he started noticing that a few players didn't have Holston on their shirts, and that's when questions started to kind of be asked. It was a calamity, but you know what? It was good. It was good publicity in the end for Holston, and a few people kind of lost their jobs. But Holston weren't bothered at all. They were quite pleased that it raised the profile of Holston as a sponsor. So maybe Spurs were a bit too knee jerky with how they reacted to some people about how they dealt with him. But it turned out to be good publicity. But it wasn't a great day. Lovely day, beautiful sunshine. Yeah, but not.
And it started
not the
so well,
day
didn't it? Clive, 2 minutes in, and Clive puts us 1-0 up.
Yeah,
I when I was doing research, I actually found 3 days before, I think Ajax had won the Cup Winners' Cup, 1-0, and Marco van Basten scored the winner, and his goal was an absolute replica of Clive Allen's goal. Chris Waddle cross, and then Clive Allen kind of glancing header. If you find that on YouTube, you can see it's an exact replica of that goal. And then when that went in, I think we probably thought it was going to be 3 or 4-0 because we were playing such good football at the time. But Coventry were kind of completely courageous, battled for everything. Spurs, they looked tired. They looked like the fact that they had played over 60 games in the season, and as opposed to Coventry, who hadn't played anywhere near that. And I think that was a contributing factor.
I think there was an issue of us mentally beginning to sort of unravel as well, wasn't there? After the League Cup final, and then falling off in the league as well. I think just everything, the sheer amount of games physically, but mentally as well. And I think that just goes to show how much football's played up here as well as it is in your feet.
I think as well, one substitute in those days. I think the cup I think had now gone up to two subs.
That's right. Yeah.
But, with small squads and things like that, you're right. Now you take people out and rotate and things like that. But in those days, you just kept going and going and going, and just mental tiredness and being flogged like a dead horse in the end, weren't you?
I'm sure. Wasn't it the 82 when we won the cup in 82? I think we'd come close in the Cup Winners' Cup. Yep, we'd done well in the league, and we were kind of on for everything.
League Cup final,
League Cup final, and then against QPR in that final, it was like, man, our season will turn into a fantastic disappointment if we don't do something. So, I think maybe fans were thinking,
42 games as well, wasn't it? The league was 42 games, not 38.
Yeah. So we did well, but I mean, fair play to Coventry. I spoke to Keith Allen. He's a great guy, a very infectious guy. And again, like Ian Allinson, that's Keith Houchin's greatest moment in his career, and he will never forget it or top it. So from his perspective, it's turned into a wonderful story. But from our perspective, we had the absolute ability to win that game with a canter, and we just kind of didn't turn up. But I think they just looked so tired and jaded. I think one of the biggest things was Mitchell Thomas. Dave Bennett on the right for Coventry, bit of a mazy winger. He ripped Mitchell a new one that day. Yeah, I mean,
it was a good player.
Mitchell was struggling for most of the game, and I think that was kind of pivotal because he was so key to everything that Coventry did that day. But we didn't take our chances either. But finalised the season, which was so much promise, but ended with nothing. That's why Jason is a fantastic disappointment.
When you're looking back at that season, as you're right, Everton won the league. We finished third in the end, top London club. Leicester, Man City and Aston Villa, three big clubs were relegated. Chelsea and Man United finished in the bottom half, whilst Norwich, Wimbledon, Luton, Watford and Coventry all made the top half of the table. Our football's changed, and that's the season as well that people probably won't remember. Playoffs started to come into football then, but in those days, the bottom three went down, three came up, and then the team that finished fourth from bottom had to play off against the three to see if it could stay in the top flight. And I think that was Charlton Leeds, wasn't it? Which two legs again went to a draw. So again, another replay. You didn't really have penalty shootouts in those days, did we? Too much, other than UEFA Cup final. But I think Charlton ended up staying up by beating Leeds.
And do you know what? Anybody under 105 years old is going to say, these guys are making this up. This never happened in football, all this. Them finishing bottom, them finishing near the top. This is nonsense. Honestly, this is how crazy football used to be. It was nuts.
It just shows you as well that clubs had money, but it was nowhere near the balance of money dictated where you were. So you could have Luton, Watford and Coventry finishing above Man United. Man United can still buy players, but that disparity that you get now just wasn't there. Hence, when Tottenham got relegated, you didn't have to sell Hoddle, and you didn't have to sell Stevie Perrymans, and you didn't have to sell, your best players just because you went down, which nowadays is unthinkable, isn't it?
I mean, again, back then, a big fee. Let's talk about Goff. Goff didn't survive too long after that, did he? Because I think personal problems meant that he had to go back to Scotland, and Souness finally got his man. By the way, Souness was trying to get him during the Mexico World Cup. Fact. Pleat's quite keen that Souness was tapping him up during that period. But again, that's another story in itself. But we bought him for 750,000. We sold him a year later for 1.5 million. They were huge figures at the time, and things that probably most clubs weren't used to, apart from probably some of the big clubs. Again, remember, 18 months later, we bought Paul Gascoigne for 2.1 million, 2.2, and that was a record at the time. And even, going back to Scholar again, the reason why they sold Goff as well is because they just said, well, if you want Richard Goff, double what we paid for him, you can have him, not expecting Rangers to do it. And they did it. They offered 1.5 and they said, well, okay, yeah, we'll take that. And the same thing happened with Chrissy Waddle. Chrissy Waddle, I think his final season at Spurs, I think he was playing up top. He scored for fun. He was absolutely brilliant. His best season by far. I think
that season.
Was it 88, 89, something like that? And he had just signed a new 6-year contract. And then a few months later, he was called in. Marseille were on this campaign to kind of create this team of Galacticos. And they offered 2.5. Scholar said no. He said, how much do you want? I think he said like 4.5. And he said, yeah, okay, we'll pay it. And they were like, what? And then Chris Waddle was called into the office and said, you're going. And I don't think even Chris Waddle wanted to go.
No.
But money talks. They were huge fees back then. And now they're nothing. You can get a reserve. You can get a 17-year-old for 5 million nowadays, and no one really bats an eyelid.
You get a Tongi and Dombele for 65.
Oh, stop!
Don't go
Let's
there.
not go there.
Don't go there. But I mean that season that ends, as you say, with nothing to show for some absolute brilliant. I mean, I genuinely think we were the best team in the country that year. Played the best football, and a lot of games caught up with us for sure. But Glenn's departure was bound to hit us hard. Tony Galvin moved on. Paul Miller had joined Charlton by then. And then, as you say, that the losing Richard Goff that summer after just 1 year. And by autumn of the following year, David Pleat had gone, Ray Clements had packed up, and it wasn't long before Clive Allen was leaving as well. So that whole group just fell by the wayside really quickly. And you just look at that couple of years and think, so close, bit like the Poch era, and yet just nothing to show for it. And once again, missed opportunities.
But you know what, Jace, this is football. Do you know, those sliding doors moments?
Yeah.
Those moments when you think if Hodder would have stayed, if Goff would have stayed, if Pleat would have stayed, if things would have been different. They could have been different. But the reality is that if Pleat would have stayed, Venables wouldn't have come, and Lineker wouldn't have come, and Gascoigne wouldn't have come, and all the joy that we were lucky to see. The best football Paul Gascoigne played in his career was the season before and after the Italian World Cup.
Yeah.
No matter what he did before at Newcastle, what he did at Rangers after that, that was his best football. And we were pleasured. We had the pleasure of seeing Glenn Hoddle. We had the pleasure of seeing Diego Maradona, but we had the pleasure of seeing Paul Gascoigne at his absolute peak. And if Pleat was there, he wouldn't have probably come because Venables was a catalyst in that. So football's about the things that did happen, but the good thing about football is about the things that could have happened as well. And that's why we love the game, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. But we also had the joy of listening to Diamond Lights as well. I don't know if that quite was a joy, but listen, Stephen.
It was nice to have a glass of wine, wasn't it, as well, that season?
Yeah.
It just felt quite sweet that around semi-final time. Can I have 4 more glasses?
Crazy. Some brilliant memories, Stephen, and there's a whole host more in the book, and as you say, there's interview with opposition players to get their perspective, media match reports in there, even a mention of the EastEnders Christmas special that year, back when EastEnders was a big thing. Look, do you know what? This isn't just a book for us old men that shout at clouds and moan how football used to be great. I think even if you wasn't really around and going football at that time, reading this just gives you that almost the genesis of where we are today. As you said earlier, Stephen, it was that change in time, just when it began to, the trouble subsided that you was getting. There was more marketing savvy going on in clubs, and that season was a real time capsule of that beginning of the change, and then leading up to Italian 90, as you spoke about as well earlier, and the real big change comes. So, it really is a book for everybody to go away have a read of, and just get a flavour of what everything we've got today, where it all come from, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's it was a snapshot in time, memorable for us for so many good reasons and also bad reasons. But you're right, so many things happened that was to spark the evolution of how we see football today. And like everything always has its origins, doesn't it? And Spurs were at the forefront of lots of those commercial changes. Some good, some not so great. But again, that's part of football. The latter part of all the players I interviewed was spending time with Danny Thomas. What a lovely guy, so optimistic, so upbeat, and he's really kind of, considering his football career completely went down the Swanee because of that challenge. He's reinvented his life, but he puts things into perspective. And one of the final chapters I talk about is spending time with him, where he talks about certain things that happened around the time when he got injured. And it's that perspective. It's perspective about things that happen in life versus things that happen in football. And you know what? We do get kind of highly strung and emotionally involved with things that do happen in football, but there are other things in life that level us off as well. So it's a bit of a happy medium to say to ourselves, good things happen, bad things happen, but again, at the end of the day, we are human beings.
Absolutely. So to the important bits. Go on, Jason. Sorry.
Just on that injury, wasn't that sickening? Chris Basham yesterday. Oh,
yes.
Dear, oh dear.
Yeah.
Just horrific.
It does show you how quickly, bang, it can all be over. It really can.
Injury.
That's it. Yeah. Whole life turned upside down. So you're right, Stephen. You have to keep a lot of these things in perspective, don't you? So, Stephen, I'll ask you again, where can we find you on the socials? That's twice I've asked now. Normally I forget. Now I've done it twice. On the socials, you are?
At FD Book THFC. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Just search for Steve Peace. You can get the details of my publisher as well. They're called Kronos Publishing. Best place to get it is probably Amazon or Waterstones. They kind of sell hardback, paperback, and if you're kind of tech savvy and you like the Kindle, go for the Kindle.
Brilliant stuff. Excellent. Jace, you probably enjoyed reading this, didn't you?
I did, and there was no pictures, so it took me some getting used to, mate, I tell you. But, mate, it's 500 pages, and like I say, it's a really comprehensive look. Not just, like I say, at games, so many events. We haven't covered all the events that were going on that season and bits and pieces, but brings back some fantastic memories. I'm sure all of those that remember that season will enjoy reading it. But you're right, Crackers, there's so much context that applies today. Like we say, dithering chairman. And people think it's just a new thing, but some of the problems of Tottenham Hotspur today are relevant.
Been there, done that. Seen it all before.
Guys, can I add one more thing on that as well? Do you know, ever since the book was released in the summer, I've had people from all over the world contacting me. The Spurs fans in the Spurs community, they're pretty tight.
Brilliant.
And it's amazing when you get nice feedback from different people in different countries from around the world, because their memories are with them in some way, shape or form. So, the Spurs community is pretty priceless.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. They certainly are. All right. Well, listen, we'll put details out of where you can find Steve and the book across the at Last Word on Spurs socials. Steve, peace out, as they say. Well done.
Absolutely.
Fantastic book. I hope, the sales go through the roof, and brilliant stuff. Jace, brilliant as ever. Well done to you, sir, mate. As well.
What a weekend it's been.
Yes.
What a weekend it's been. Seeing Tottenham top of the Premier League, top of the under-21s, top of the under-18s. The women's team have won today. What a weekend. It's Carlsberg weekend, isn't it? It's a Carlsberg job.
The only thing is, I do remember another season that was like this. Let's hope this one doesn't go. Let's hope you're not writing the book of this season in 37 years' time, Steve. All right, lovely stuff.
The chronicles of fantastic disappointment as the seasons go. Yeah.
It's fair to say Richarlison won't get 49 goals, though.
Hey, never say never, mate. Never say never.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much. Listen, everyone, keep safe, keep well. As always, come on, you Spurs.
Come on, you Spurs.